And I don't want to be the type of pastor who encourages people to, championing one movie over another, but when I saw that trailer and what we were going to be talking about today, it just fit so perfectly. And we should talk to Wes about having his son being okay with people licking him. So in 2002, a really influential book came out that many of you, I'm sure, if you didn't read yourself, at least saw it on the bookshelf or part of sort of the greater conversation that was going on in our culture. The name of the book was The Purpose-Driven Life. How many of you at least saw it probably everyone's seen it on the bookshelf. So in 2002, Dr. Rick Warren, who is the senior minister up in Saddleback, in 2002, Dr. Warren was pretty much known as a regional pastor, an evangelical minister of a large congregation who was known sort of on the West Coast, but in 2002, he really did explode onto the national scene as the Purpose-Driven Life moved its way up the New York Times bestseller list. And if you remember what the cover of A Purpose-Driven Life looked like, it had on top of, in big kind of fancy letters, A Purpose-Driven Life, but at the very bottom of the book, it asked a very profound question. And the question that it asked was, what on earth am I here for? What on earth am I here for? Now, I'm not a fan of some of the traditional evangelical theology that is in the book, and I definitely had a few issues with Dr. Warren's picking and choosing of certain scripture verses to rationalize his own points, and his way of using doctrine as a way to strengthen his argument. But there was a lot in the book that I liked as well, including this question of pondering very deeply for weeks and months after I read that book. What on earth am I here for? Do you remember 2002? That's 14, 15 years ago. We were living in the very beginnings of a post-9/11 America. And when I encountered the book, I was questioning my call. I had just graduated from seminary. I had taken my first call to be the pastor of a small church on the eastern plains of Montana. And as I was beginning my ministry, the drums of war were being banged in this country, and we were on the verge of the invasion in Iraq. And whether or not you felt that was a just or unjust decision by our government, the fact of the matter is those drums were being banged, and those drums were being banged very prominently by Christian ministers. So while that was going on, Dr. Warren releases this book, asking people to think about what their purpose in life is and what on earth we are here for. It spoke in a different way than the general culture was talking about, with the tide of war and destruction on the horizon and the hatred and the vitriol towards Islamic people. The hijackers had been poisoned. Their hearts had been poisoned by leaders who had perverted the peaceful religion of Islam. And they had done horrible things. And now we were going to respond. And the response that the United States had come up with was with violence. And regardless of your decision and your thoughts about that, the fact of the matter is we were going to kill innocent people. Children who had no idea who Osama bin Laden or George W. Bush were, children who had never heard of Washington, D.C. or New York City were going to die. And we were going to lose men and women in our country who were just following orders and doing what the government asked them to do. And I ended up bearing and presiding over funerals for 2 or 3 of those young men and women in eastern Montana who died in the Iraq invasion. So what good was I, 26 years old, pastor of a small church, eastern Montana? I had no voice. I had no leverage. The inevitable war and the looming death that was to come for so many, what good was I? And I was asking myself this question: what on earth am I here for? And occasionally over the last 15 years of my professional life, that question has popped up again and again. What on earth am I here for? Big things like national and international events and small things like personal experiences have caused that question to rattle around in my brain and in my mind and in my spirit. And I don't think I'm alone. How many of you have asked yourself a version of that question? What on earth am I here for? And if you have, congratulations, you're in good company. Because the prophet Jeremiah has asked himself that very thing. The prophet Jeremiah was born into an aristocratic household in Jerusalem. He was a Hebrew intelligentsia, and he had the ear of the king Josiah. And God called the prophet Jeremiah to a time to prophesy to the people before the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem and the beginning of the Babylonian exile. And in the face of all of this, the prophet Jeremiah and these huge international events that were being forced upon him, he often in the book and his prophecy of Jeremiah speaks to God and questions God about his own worthiness and effectiveness. And if you've been to Europe and seen many of the medieval paintings and renditions of the prophet Jeremiah, you often see him being portrayed as crying, as weeping. He's known as the weeping prophet because he is often crying before the throne of God, asking God, why am I here and what good am I doing? He even has his own book that's full of prayers and poems and sermons about asking himself this question: what on earth am I here for? The book is called Lamentations, and it is full of lament. And Jesus himself, in the Garden of Gethsemane, stands upon the shoulders of the prophet Jeremiah who came before him, and he was asking himself that very question. If this is God's plan, if this crucifixion is truly God's plan, Jesus prays to God in the Garden of Gethsemane, then God, remove this cup from me. But your will be done. Give me a purpose. Tell me what I am here for. It is Jesus' prayer in the garden is an echo of Jeremiah's own reluctance to be a prophet to the people of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. What do you want from me, God? What good am I doing? What is my purpose? What on earth am I here for? And in God's amazing crypticness, and asking Jeremiah to dive into the deep mystery of God, God doesn't give a direct answer, but says, get up, Jeremiah, and go down to the potter's shop and observe and witness and report what you see. Broken pottery being repurposed. New pottery being created, kilned, glazed, made to be of use, made to be of purpose. In 1976, Dorothy Dooling created a quarterly magazine called Parabola. Any Parabola fans out there? I'm in good company, obviously. The Parabola quarterly was dedicated to myth and the quest for meaning, and I was a huge fan. I discovered it in high school. My high school library ran the quarterly every 4 months. And Dorothy Dooling became a hero of mine as she introduced me to people like Joseph Campbell and Elaine Pagels and Elie Wiesel and Ursula de Guin. And in the inaugural issue of Parabola magazine, in the foreword and the introduction, Dooling wrote these very words in the first issue of the quarterly. She writes, and I quote, "I believe in this conviction, that the human existence is significant, that life essentially makes sense in spite of our confusions, and that we are not here on earth by accident, but for a purpose. And whatever that purpose may be, it demands from us the discovery of our own meaning. Human existence is significant. In spite of all of that, it makes sense in spite of all of the confusions. And we are not here by accident, but we have a purpose. And that purpose demands of us that we discover what our meaning is. We must discover our own meaning, our deepest purpose, each moment of each day, and that might change and evolve over time. Even in the midst of confusions, our purposes are significant. We are significant. And the thing is that such purposes are not static, even when they are not even understood. God says, come down to the potter's house. Discover your meaning. Watch what the potter does and tell me what you see. A creator, an artist, applying his trade so that others may use his craft for the betterment of their own lives. See how the potter is making things new. But sometimes we're not beckoned to a potter's house, but we're told to go to a bedroom. And we visit, and we observe a parent sitting on the corner of a bed, rubbing the back of his or her child, consoling them after their young one had experienced their very first broken heart. And sometimes it's not a potter's house that we're called to visit, but a funeral home chapel where a colleague of the deceased stands and shares a story to give some comfort and respite for the grieving. And sometimes it's not a potter's house, but a kitchen that we find ourselves in, and we observe as neighbors prepare a meal for a homeless shelter for the men and women and children who are in need of a nutritious meal. And sometimes it's not a potter's shop or a potter's house, but a sanctuary that we find ourselves in, and we observe people praying, parishioners praying again and again and again, Lord, have your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And sometimes it's not a potter's house, but it's a hospital room that we visit. And we see friends bringing the healing agent of laughter to a person in pain, sick and ailing. And sometimes it's not a potter's house that we're in, but we find ourselves relishing in a school classroom, watching a tutor assist a child who is struggling to make sense of those numbers. And we see the courage of a child trying again and again and again to make it all make sense. And sometimes it's not a potter's house, but it's a 12-step program that we're sitting around. And we see the unconditional grace of a group accepting one who has fallen off the wagon and encouraging him to take that first step of the first day of the rest of his life. And sometimes it's not a potter's house, but it's an accounting office, but not a financial one, a moral one. And after adding up the ledger, you see that there is a debt that needs to be repaid because you're a prodigal son or an absent friend or a negligent pastor. And you ask for forgiveness so that the ledger can be balanced. And sometimes it's not a potter's house, but a room full of mirrors that we find ourselves in. And we are simply asked to observe and to report what we see in the mirror as we ask God to yet again bless us, to remind us that we are created in God's image, sacred and divine, and blessed to be very, very good. Sometimes it's not a potter's house, but in each time, the Lord our God says to us, can I not do with you what I have done, what this potter has done? God has a special purpose for all of us, each in our own way, but we're often not receptive to it. We ignore it. We neglect it. But when that special purpose connects us with God, and that God has for us, then our life flourishes and the life of others flourish. Each one of these observances of the different types of Potter's House and places that I mentioned, each thing that we saw and witnessed is good in and of itself, by themselves. They are each, those acts, inherently good. But when those actions take the form of us living into God's purposes, we find meaning. We find an answer to the question, what on earth am I here for? God's purposes are apparent. By grace freely given, through a love that has no end, we are invited to live into God's grace by sharing that love reflected in God's true purposes for us all. We are here to be loved. You are here on this planet to be loved. That is your purpose. To be a vessel to receive love. And we are put on this planet for the purposes for our vessel to be poured out and our love to be shared. You are here to be loved, and you are here to love. We are here to love ourselves, as hard as that may be sometimes. And we are here to love our neighbors, human and non, no matter how hard that can be sometimes. And when international events or personal circumstances cause us to go into an existential crisis, which we will all do again, God will be there to beckon us to the Potter's House, to observe, to witness, to report, to remember, to share, to know God's grace, God's love, and God's peace. And that is the good news this day. That is the good news of the gospel for each and every one of us. God is molding you into a vessel to be loved. God is asking you to pour out yourself to love others. Thanks be to God. Amen.